Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the first of 4 lectures in our summer series of talks. I want to welcome those of you who are joining us through Zoom or YouTube, and those of you who are here with us in the room. Welcome. These lectures will follow what we call the Scholars in the Square format, in which we ask the speaker to present their lecture in about 20 minutes. Then there will be a 20-minute period in which the speaker will engage in conversation with someone who knows the research field quite well. In this case, it's Dr. Lynn Marks, who is a professor in our history department, who will be joining us through Zoom. Hi, Lynn. I'm not sure if you can see me, but I can see you on one of our screens. After Lynn and Tina talk for 20 minutes, I'll share a broader discussion period with the members of the actual and virtual communities for about 20 minutes. So it's a 1-hour experience. Our speaker today is Dr. Tina Block, and she's a visiting research fellow with us this summer, and she's a professor of history at Thompson Rivers University. Tina completed her PhD here at UBC in 2007, and since then she's been at Thompson Rivers where she teaches Canadian history in the history department. She published The Secular Northwest, Religion and Irreligion in Everyday Postwar Life in 2016 with UBC Press, and has published articles and chapters in a wide variety of leading journals and really wonderful books. Her UBC book actually really helped inform my own thinking when I put together a team of scholars with the intention of interpreting this very peculiar space of Cascadia. And I was really pleased when she agreed to work with Lynn Marks on a chapter in that book on that we now call Religion at the Edge. So Tina's really helped many of us understand the ways the growth of irreligion, that is to say non-religion, reflects broader and complex historical changes. And it seems to me that any history with an interest in the implications of the past or any kind of future we might build together will need to factor in the role of Indigenous communities in all of these shifts. And so I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Osage peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So please join me in welcoming Tina to our real and digital stages.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for joining, all of you who are here in person and over Zoom. I'd also like to thank the many wonderful students who have worked as research assistants on my project. I'd like to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the TRU Office of Vice President Research for funding support. I want to give my deepest thanks to the many people that I interviewed for this project. I just want to thank them so much for giving so generously of their time and their memories. Thank you to Lynn, my friend, for her ongoing support and for joining our conversation as a dialogue partner. And thank you to everybody at the center, especially Paul, Rachel, Scott, and Noriko, for providing warm support and inspiration. I feel so fortunate to have had this time at the center, at a place as welcoming as the center, and on a campus as beautiful as the University of Victoria. And I want to echo Paul in acknowledging with deep gratitude and respect the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples who have a historic and ongoing relationship to these lands. A lot of the research for this project took place in Kamloops at Thompson Rivers University, and I want to acknowledge also that campus is on the lands of the Kamloops, Tishoquatmik, and the Taywal within Secwepemc Hulu, the traditional and unceded territory of the Secwepemc peoples. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk with you all today about my ongoing research, which is looking at the history of unbelief in English Canada from the late 1950s through to the 1980s. That time period, and particularly the 1960s, saw a significant decline in organized religion, particularly Christian involvement in Canada. That time also saw a gradual rise in the number of Canadians who rejected, ignored, or dismissed religious belief entirely. Those who may or may not have identified as atheists or unbelievers, but who, to borrow a phrase from his British historian Callum Brown, lived their lives as if there is no God. I'm interested in why people turned or stayed away from religious belief, but I'm also interested in what it meant to be a non-believer and how non-belief did or maybe didn't shape one's social experiences, one's family relationships, and so on. To better understand the experience of being or becoming a non-believer, I've been looking at a range of printed sources, including surveys and censuses, newspapers, church archives, and secular humanist writings. I've also interviewed about 100 people who were born in 1960 or earlier and who turned or stayed away from religious belief between the 1950s and the late 1970s. So I conducted interviews a few years back in British Columbia and Ontario, and then more recently in Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia. I interviewed slightly more men than women, and the interviewees are predominantly white and of European descent. So today what I want to do is touch on some of the themes that are emerging from the oral histories, which I'm still in process of transcribing and analyzing. And I also want to try to tie some of those themes and some of the stories from the interviewees to the broader context of the time, a context in which open unbelief was relatively uncommon and often regarded with suspicion. So much of my talk does focus on the 1960s, a decade that saw significant change in, and I would say substantial erosion of, the stigma against atheism and unbelief in Canada. To reject religious belief, to deny the existence of God, to call oneself an atheist, these sorts of things could certainly still raise an eyebrow in the 70s, the 80s, and beyond. But they were far less likely to evoke the sort of public animosity that they did just a few years earlier. So my focus in this project is on those who denied or drifted away from religious belief, but I want to start by looking at the rejection of institutional Christianity, because for many of my interviewees, rejecting the church was the start of their journey to unbelief. Most of the people that I spoke with were raised in at least nominally Christian households, and many turned away from the churches as teenagers or young adults. And this is not a pattern that's unique to my study, but it fits with broader post-war trends. The sharp decline in church involvement that began during the 60s in Canada affected all generations, but was most apparent among the young. These years also saw a growth in the number of people in Canada who said they have no religion. I just have a couple of basic graphs up on the screen. The percentage of people claiming no religion jumped from 0.4% in 1951 to 4.3% in 1971, which was a proportionately larger increase than at any other time in the 20th century. And then the proportion of the population claiming that they had attended church or synagogue in the past week declined also quite sharply in that time period. So why did a growing number of Canadians turn away from the churches in the 60s and 70s? In that time period, the churches in Canada and beyond were increasingly criticized as irrelevant, hypocritical, and out of touch with the changing times. Many of the people that I talked to clearly remember and were themselves a part of this growing challenge to organize Christianity. As one woman said, during the 60s, everyone was just so angry with the church. Probably the most common response given by those interviewees who did reject the church is that they were turned off as teenagers or young adults by what they saw as the hypocrisy of the churches and also of churchgoers. And I just have a few quotes on the screen that get at that issue of hypocrisy. The participants in this study, again, weren't unique in pointing to the hypocrisy of Sunday Christians, that people weren't practicing what they were preaching, and so on. These kinds of criticisms of the Christian churches circulated widely in the 60s. For instance, in 1965, a writer for the UBC student paper, the UBC, launched a scathing attack on the churches. The author wrote, "Christians are liars and hypocrites and perpetrators of an irrelevant, incoherent, dead faith that nobody ascribes to anyway. It'd be nice to have a lot fewer Christians and a lot more human beings. In today's church, you can't be both. To hell with the churches." Generally, for those people, those interviewees who had some involvement with the churches, their departure from those churches tended to be quite abrupt. By contrast, journeys to unbelief were typically more gradual and often characterized by a period, often a long period, of drift from or indifference to religion. And I just have some quotes there from some of the interviews that capture that sort of that gradual part of the journey. One interviewee described a long period of not thinking much about religion and then gradually coming to acknowledge his unbelief. He said, "I just realized that why do I go along with this religious belief that there is a God? It wasn't affecting my life. It wasn't even in my life at that time. It wasn't a conscious act so much, my getting away from religious beliefs. It wasn't something I pursued. It just happened. It was a slow process over the years to where I'm at." So this pattern in the interviews, again, reflects broader changes in religion in Canada at the time. While involvement in institutional Christianity declined quite sharply in the 60s, Changes to religious belief over the post-war era were certainly more gradual, and data on religious belief at the time is a bit spotty. Surveys show that about 95% of Canadians professed to believe in a God in 1947, about 92% in 69, and 88% in 78, and so on. That journeys to unbelief were often, though certainly not always, gradual, reflects, I think, in part the stigma against atheism that lingered through those years. Voices critical of institutional religion grew louder at the time, but open denials of religious belief, public admissions of atheism remained relatively uncommon. So a lot of the people that I talked to said they wouldn't have admitted at the time that they didn't believe in God. They wouldn't have publicly identified as atheists in that era. And again, just some quotes that point from the interviews that point to that stigma and silencing. You didn't walk around the streets saying you're an atheist, or people would think you're a wingnut. People wouldn't call themselves atheists, and so on. One interviewee said that because the term atheist was, quote, a dirty word, he shied away from using it to refer to himself. Now, atheism was especially vilified at the time, but it was also socially unacceptable to say that you didn't believe in God or to call yourself a non-believer. One woman recalled her surprise when one of her high school classmates in the late 60s began discussing the non-existence of God. She said, we were talking once, and he brought up that there's no God in all this. He may have been quoting Nietzsche, I can't remember, but I'd never heard any of this. I mean, I'd never heard it articulated. I felt that it was almost frightening. It was kind of alarming. That participants in the study were certainly not alone in pointing to the silence and stigma around atheism and unbelief during the post-war decades. It's really obvious when you start to read newspapers and those sorts of things at the time. For example, in 1963, the Victoria Colonist ran a series on religion in the city in which the reporter claimed, I talked to at least 10 people who denied there was a God, but who asked me upon my word of honor not ever to publish their names along with their statements. That same series found that atheist school teachers were under particular pressure to keep silent about their unbelief. A woman interviewed for this series said that when she admitted to a United Church minister that she and her husband didn't believe in God, quote, his jaw literally fell open. He said he couldn't believe it. Your husband's a teacher. He's teaching young children. I have to report this. To avoid further hostile responses, she and her husband kept silent about their unbelief. She said, we found it easier to be hypocrites than to say that we don't believe. During the 50s and early 60s, atheism was often treated with hostility and suspicion in the wider media, and certainly by churches and cultural leaders. And these are just some examples of sort of headlines from the day. In 1960, a letter writer to the Toronto Daily Star called for the collection of a fund to send, quote, all of the infidels and their sympathizers to atheistic Russia where they belong. In that same year, the Calgary Herald echoed other papers from across Canada in warning that communism was dangerous because of its atheism. In 1961, Canadian broadcaster Gordon Sinclair commented on the prospect of the CBC potentially allowing programs on atheism and agnosticism. He said that if they did so, quote, the broadcaster will have to be a stout-hearted citizen willing to accept unending abuse, insult, and ridicule. It will come at him coast to coast in a never-ending stream. Sinclair spoke from experience in response to his occasional expressions of religious doubt and disbelief throughout his broadcasting career. He was the recipient, in his words, of hate mail to a degree you can't imagine. Casual references to sort of dangers or evils of atheism and unbelief aren't difficult to find in the public media of the 1950s and in the wider Canadian public realm. And you can certainly still find such references in the 60s, 70s, and beyond. But I think the first half of the 60s saw a significant change in this regard. Statements or actions denigrating irreligion or unbelief that may have passed without much notice or comment just a few years earlier start to draw at least some public censure in the 1960s. For example, and these are just some examples of sort of some positive views of atheism, I guess, or defense of atheists in the media, and I'll talk about a couple of them. In 1961, Prime Minister Diefenbaker gave a speech in which he described the Cold War as, quote, a struggle between the forces of religion and irreligion. That is to say, the forces of good and the forces of bad in terms of ultimate human destiny. A number of journalists and letter writers challenged the Prime Minister's statement. One called him naive for associating atheism with evil, while another wrote that Diefenbaker's, quote, thought processes are delightfully simple. If you're religious, i.e. Christian, you're good. If you're irreligious, i.e. atheist, you're bad. It is astonishing and profoundly disturbing that these are the views not of a medieval churchman, but of the Prime Minister of the Democratic Free Nation of Canada. So there's a number of other instances in the 1960s when the notion of atheism as bad or immoral or evil sparked some pushback. Student newspapers at many universities across Canada in the 60s contained extensive discussion on the subject of unbelief. In 1961, a student was quoted in the Queen's Journal commenting on the prevalence of atheism among university students. He said, quote, atheism appeals to most students because it makes no claims on them. It leaves them free to pursue the irresponsible, hedonistic existence characteristic of one's student days. In response, the editor of the Queen's Journal penned an article titled Virtuous Atheists, in which he took to task what he called one of the most pernicious fallacies of our time, namely the assumption that a man who does not believe in God must necessarily be less virtuous than a man who does. That the kind of open, taken for granted anti-atheism of the 50s no longer held was especially evident in public response to the denial of citizenship to two Dutch immigrant couples, the Bergsmas and the Vanderpoels. Media reports suggest that both couples were denied citizenship due to their atheism because they refused to take an oath stating, "So help me God." The extensive public responses to these cases was overwhelmingly sympathetic to these couples. An article in the Saskatoon Star Phoenix described the Bergsmas as quiet, industrious, and honest folk that many would regard as ideal citizens. Letter after letter to Canadian papers praised both couples for their honesty and for choosing honesty and authenticity over hypocrisy. One wrote that in clinging to the letter of the law, the judge denied Mr. Bergsmas citizenship not because he is an atheist, but because he is not a liar. So the support garnered by the Bergsmas and Vanderpoels, which was remarked on with surprise by many journalists, points to at least some wearing away of the stigma against atheism, at least when we compare it to the 1950s. That support was also fueled by the criticism of Christian hypocrisy that circulated so widely at the time. The atheism of the Bergsmas and the Vanderpoels was characterized as honorable due to its authenticity and because it ran counter to the apparent hypocrisy of those who performed rather than felt or lived their faith. Of course, the support shown these Dutch couples was also underscored by the fact that they were white immigrants from a predominantly Christian country. While they contravened social convention by professing atheism, they did so from a place of race and ethnic privilege. Scholars have shown that the social risks associated with open unbelief were and are unevenly distributed according to race, gender, and a range of other categories. And I'm just starting to tease out some of the ways that not only the risks, but also more generally, the lived experience of unbelief varied across different contexts and according to social relations. What's clear so far in my research is that many factors shape decisions about how or whether to be open about one's unbelief, and that such decisions involve far more than a straightforward choice between hypocrisy or honesty. I'm just going to touch on three, by sort of a way of leading into conclusion, three different contexts that have mattered a great deal to many of my interviewees. Many told me that they weren't open about their unbelief with family and close friends. One man said to me, in order to keep peace with my family, I don't speak on religion. Sometimes people chose to keep quiet in order to maintain domestic peace, but more often I would say they did so out of a deep sense of care and respect for their loved ones. As one woman said, I can remember sitting with my mom and her talking about how much she believes in God and Jesus, and me listening to her and thinking to myself, this is fine for you, but I know in my heart that this is not what I believe, but I think it's so important to be respectful. Another woman similarly said that she was quiet about her unbelief in the presence of a close friend so as not to detract from the comfort that her friend found in religion. She said, I knew that would hurt her because of her daughter. She believes her daughter's in heaven with Jesus. Journeys away from religion and decisions about whether or not to be open about unbelief were also shaped by gender. Men certainly encountered the stigma against unbelief, but rejecting religious belief continued to be a more acceptable path for men than for women through this time period. So many of the women that I talked to admitted to generally keeping silent about their non-belief during the 60s and 70s, although that silence was contingent and contextual and varied by social context. And a lot of the women who I talked to who were really active in the women's and feminist movement found that those spaces were actually quite supportive of unbelief. Finally, those interviewees who were part of the privileged few to attend college or university during that era, the 60s and 70s, recall an openness to unbelief in those spaces. One man said he was open about his atheism at UBC during the 60s. He said, "I never held back at university. There was no reason to, or in my fraternity where I was very active, but I was always very careful at work and with parents, girlfriends, or other friends for that matter, because it could be quite a sensitive topic." A couple of the interviewees attributed their rejection of religious belief explicitly to their exposure to new ideas in university, but most of the interviewees described their experience at university or college as affirming rather than causing their religious doubts. All right, to conclude. In the records of the Humanist Association of Canada, I came across a letter that wasn't dated, but was likely written during the 70s. In it, the author comments on, quote, humanism's reluctance to extend a helping hand to struggling fellow non-believers. According to the author, the road from believer to humanist is often a long and rocky one, and too many travelers feel utterly alone on the journey. My research suggests that the road from believer to humanist, or in this case, more simply, from believer to non-believer, could indeed be a long and sometimes rocky one. Many of the interviewees turned or stayed away from churches that they saw as hypocritical or irrelevant, and in so doing, they were part of the broader challenge to institutional Christianity that emerged in the post-war years. Journeys to unbelief tended to be longer and more hesitant, complicated as they were by this sort of lingering stigma against atheism, a stigma, again, that lingered although it was being challenged and eroded during the 60s. I spent a lot of time in this talk focusing on silencing and stigma, so I want to end on a more positive note. While it's true that the road to unbelief could be a long and rocky one, the interviewees assured me over and over again that the journey was well worth it. In the words of one woman, being a non-believer has given me the freedom to really expand who I've wanted to be. I've taken the responsibility to really develop myself in ways I would never have been able to do in religion. Religion is a box, and you can't easily get past that cardboard wall. I feel I am so much more than what religion would have made me in my life. I don't believe, and I'm glad of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. That was perfect. Okay, so now, Lynn, I don't know what you're looking at on the screen. Hopefully us. And so I'll just let the two of you engage in some conversation.
Okay. Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Anna. I really enjoyed your talk. It's important work, as always. So I have a few questions. I know you never can do everything you want to do in a short talk, so questions are mostly about asking you to elaborate on some points. So the first question I have is related to chronology. So you sketch out clearly how irreligion was seen very negatively in the 1950s. So as a historian who's done more in the 19th century, I just wondered if you could say anything about whether attitudes towards irreligion and atheism in the 50s were consistent or inconsistent with Canadian attitudes towards atheism going back to the 19th century and up to the 50s, and whether there was any change over that period.
Mm-hmm. Thanks again, Lynn, for being here, and thanks so much for that very good question. Yeah, I think there's definitely some consistency with the sort of, I guess, sort of dominant Christian, what I would say, dominant Christian culture from sort of your time period, the late 19th century, and era of settlement across the country, white settlement, European settlement across the country, when and so on through to the 1950s. One thing I would, and then I sort of see the dramatic change happening in the 1960s. But I do think in some ways the 1950s are also a bit unique, right? I would say put the late 40s in there as well. And because there was this, what many call a kind of revival of religion or Christianity in that time period. So there's this idea that, after so many years of depression and war, that there was this sort of return to the churches. So there's a real surge in church building and church membership and affiliation and attendance and all that in the 50s. And of course, part of that also relates to the wider global context at the time of the Cold War. So, although I definitely see strands of similarity with your period and through that time, and Elliot will tell us maybe he will in a couple of weeks about whether there is much difference in the 30s and so on. And I think there are differences along the way, of course, but I do see a lot of parallels between, say, the 50s and the late 19th century. But again, in the 1950s, there's of course a virulent strand of anti-communism that runs through so much of the anti-atheist rhetoric coming out of not just the States, but of course Canada. So many times when you see the anti-atheist rhetoric in the late 40s and 50s, it's linked to, in this kind of taken for granted way, to communism. So I think that's something that's a bit unique, but also parallels with your era, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And again, this may be, well, particularly true for the 50s, but this shift you show in the 60s that you no longer have to be religious to be moral. Like, where did this notion of if you were an atheist, you were necessarily immoral? Can you say more about where that came from?
Yeah, I think that's also such a good question. Where does anything come from? But no, I think when we're talking about in this context, I think it kind of goes back to something I was just saying about the sort of dominant Christian culture that was established in Canada with settler colonialism and so on, and in the following years and entrenched into the 20th century. And most Canadians identified with the Christian faith, and Christianity was, permeated, political systems and the education system in sometimes overt and sometimes more subtle kinds of ways. And so I think there was this sort of, I don't know, this almost compulsory culture of belief in Canada, I would argue, or a Christian belief, really, a belief in God, in the time period that I'm looking at. So I think, and then of course, yeah, just this idea, I don't know if I'm getting specifically at the question around morality, but I think they were tied together, right? Christianity, morality, espoused by Christian leaders, but espoused also by university presidents, and this, connection between belief in God, Christian belief in God, and morality, was part of the ether, explicitly and also more subtly through that time period.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the 60s came, right? And everything changed. That's the story, and that's clearly true. So I just wonder if you can say, and you do talk about this, but if you can say any more about why you think, or why other historians think, that the 60s made such a huge difference in ability to say you were an atheist, and decline in church attendance and so forth.
Yeah, that's again another good question, and probably many people in this room are familiar with the story of the 60s, again, dramatically changing religion and Christianity in Canada and beyond. And there's a debate, I won't get into deep into the debate, but about whether it's sort of one factor during the 60s changed everything, or whether it was part of more a whole bunch of different factors that kind of sort of came to the fore in the 1960s, whether the change was more gradual over time or dramatic and that kind of thing. But I tend to think it was a bunch of different factors, right? When you look at Canada, I think gender and changing gender roles is, of course, really important. And there are historians who suggest that that's sort of the main thing is women's changing roles during the 60s. More women are working outside of the home than ever before. They're attending institutions of higher education than ever before. The feminist movement is starting to surge into the 60s and 70s, and women are, and of course there's birth control, and women are, there's a decline in fertility rates, and certainly in Canada and so on, and all these things certainly gave women reflected and shaped women's greater choices in life, whether it be what to do on a Sunday or whether to go to university and those kinds of things. And so there's definitely a strong strand of in the literature that it was women leaving the churches that really caused this shift. And I think that's certainly part of the story, but there's so many other things going on too. Canada is becoming more religiously diverse, and the possibilities for being non-Christian are opening up, certainly for being a faith outside of Christianity, but also for having no faith and that kind of thing. So there's a widening of possibilities in terms of religious and non-religious diversity. There's strands in the political realm. Trudeau mania has something to do with it, I think. There's strands within the churches, of course, like reform movements that are, I don't know if I'm pinpointing the kernel of what's causing it all, but all these things are intersecting. Obviously, the counterculture and the civil rights movements and youth movements against authority in that time were also really critical in the change during that time period, and other things for sure that I'm sure I'm missing. But.
Yeah, no, sounds good. I know it's a very complicated thing to have all the pieces, but yeah, to say it's just one thing probably doesn't make much sense. So this is a question that again comes out to some extent of my own work, but also yours. So you interviewed people from 4 different provinces, right? Did you see any difference between BC and the other provinces, or any other interprovincial differences?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And this is, and again, for many people in this room, it's really the sort of regional differences and the influence of place over religious and non-religious practice and identity and meaning and that kind of thing is something that's really of deep interest to me. Again, I am still I've only recently done the interviews in Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia, so I'm still like getting into some of those differences, but I'll talk about it. I am seeing some differences, and they do sort of seem to relate to the fact that BC had a wider possibilities for non-religion and irreligion and atheism, I would say, in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And well, one thing is even just the process of finding interviewees, most of which I did through old-fashioned newspapers. I had an overabundance of people to interview in BC, but not in other provinces. So there's that. I mean, part of it, I think there's other things going on. There's also the fact that I interviewed people in my hometown, and they know TRU, and there's lots of other things going on, but I do think that maybe had part of an impact. I think what I'm seeing, again, I need to do more analysis, but from the interviews is certainly more family religion in, say, Nova Scotia and the East Coast and even Ontario than, and this relates to some other work that you and I have done, and the Cascadia Project about irreligious socialization through the years. And in British Columbia, you're far more likely to come from a family that has no religion, right? And to have parents and to be raised without religion. And so I am seeing, I think, some of that in the interviews where it's not a matter of a sort of dramatic journey to atheism, but well, I wasn't, I don't know, I didn't really think about it. There wasn't like this dramatic, oh, now I'm rejecting the churches. It's like, oh, and you've talked about it, and I'm sure others have, where, teaching religion is a bit different in the BC context often, with a lot of students who haven't, more than say in Ontario or Nova Scotia, a lot of students who haven't been raised with religion. So I think, and again, I'll be teasing this out again, it's a deep interest of mine, the intersections between place and religion and non-religion and atheism. But I do think I am seeing some of that, just again, a greater acceptance or ability, I guess, to say you're a non-believer, and maybe even less of a propensity to claim non-belief in some ways because it's not, I don't know, it's not as contested, I guess, in the British Columbia context.
Yeah, well, I look forward to you unpacking that more, because and my sense is also that Nova Scotia, right, the numbers are of people who are still believers and still churchgoers is much higher there than out west. And
Yeah.
this impact of family and tradition, and yeah, I will look forward to that. So one other question that struck me, well, I have various ones, but I know we don't have a lot of time. The impact of university and college attendance on irreligion or on confirming people's irreligion. I found it interesting that universities today, and it's not just today, even 40 years ago, have been pretty secular places. Like being religious, talking about religion could be pretty suspect. As Paul knows, and maybe some other people there, when UVic made plans to create the center, CSRS, in 1991, there was a lot of opposition from faculty who didn't want religion to have any space on this campus, on the UVic campus. So I don't know if that was a particularly BC thing, but I wondered if you could say any more about the shift of universities from being quite Christian spaces, which they certainly were in the 50s and even into the 60s, many of them, to becoming very much secular spaces. I know that's not central to what you do, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I think that's such an interesting question and relevant really for what we're for the space that we're in right now. And I just think it's so interesting because the reading that I've been doing in the 60s and through student newspapers and stuff like that, it's like, and the 50s and that kind of thing. Atheism is such like it's atheism and secularity that seems to be the big concern. But it's so interesting to hear you say that it's actually the university has become so deeply secular that religion becomes sort of the problem, I guess, or something like that. Well, I think universities. I could have made a comment earlier about university presidents, and I was thinking of a specific example, but I sort of lost the example. I think it might have been at UBC, like in the 1930s, saying something about like we're here to impart Christian values to our students and that kind of thing, like was very taken for granted, as you suggested, even in secular universities, non-denominational universities and that kind of thing. The Christian sort of ethos was very central to institutions of higher education in Canada. And I think there's, again, like the other question, there's just so many things that change. But I think in the 60s, of course, there's a surge of student radicalism and activism challenging that sort of the university as parent, as moral guardian over students. That really dramatically changes in the 60s in relation to religion, but also so many other things. So this assumption, this taken for granted assumption that parents had in a sort of a general sense prior to the 60s, that the university would continue those moral Christian values that were being imparted at the home, that falls apart in the 60s. Also, universities are becoming more decentralized. Faculty are claiming a far greater place, a far greater voice in the running of the university. That's all happening in the 60s, right? And that changes because prior to that, and I didn't talk about those examples, but when a faculty member would speak about atheism, like there was an example at UBC in 1962 when a philosophy prof gave a lecture saying, I don't believe in God, and like, it was, things went a bit crazy. The university didn't, but in Vancouver, like letters to the editor about what's going on in these ivory towers and like, that kind of thing. But in contrast to similar examples like that from, say, the 1930s, the administration didn't do anything, and it kind of went away. But anyway, so yeah, definitely universities in terms of that are really changing in the 60s for sure.
All right. Well, thanks, Lynn. You obviously stick around. Yeah, and you can continue to just participate in the broader conversation. But now we turn our attention to the folks in the room and the folks on Zoom. And I'm going to guess that Joel or Elliot or other folks have good questions, because we have some very smart people on Zoom right now. So Rachel's going to sort of articulate your questions for them.
Sure, I'll start with one then.
Sure, please.
Great. So we have a question from Ryan, who says, I hate to make this about the US, but I have a question connecting the US
Cragen?
and Canada.
Yeah.
The rise in people identifying as having no religious affiliation started earlier in Canada, the 70s and 80s, than in the US, the 1990s. I regularly argue that the rise in nuns in the US took off after the Cold War ended, but the Canadian situation makes that a weaker argument. Any thoughts why public atheism and non-religion increased in Canada before it did in the US?
That's such an interesting question. So, I mean, my first sort of thought is, even though I did say that anti-communism was virulent in Canada as it was in the States, it wasn't as virulent. So, so my first thought, I'm sure there's other things going on, but my first thought is, if what you're seeing, Ryan, is that there's it's really not until the Cold War is over that there's sort of that more openness to identifying as atheists or as of no religion. That maybe it does have to do with, the force of that Cold War anti-communist sort of culture in the States. That's one thought. Maybe, but I'm not sure. Like the strength of evangelical Christianity in the States compared to Canada might have something to do with it, but I don't have any specific more evidence about that. But yeah.
Does Ryan have a follow-up?
Yeah.
No, but Joel has a question, of course.
Okay, great.
In what ways would you say perceptions toward and experiences of atheists in Canada have changed since the late 1970s? If changes have occurred, why do you think so? If not, why not?
Yeah, well, I definitely think things have changed. And so just as many people know, when you're having conversations with people, a lot of my work is based on conversations with people. And so it's very hard to get them to say, stop talking when your memory reaches 1979 or whatever, right? So I hear a lot and in exciting ways about, and I'm very interested in how people, sort of live their unbelief today and that kind of thing. So I am certainly hearing what I think is far more openness to unbelief and non-religion in Canada even today than it was back in, say, the 70s and the 80s, and things have changed. I don't know, the charter in 82 changed things. Things have changed since that time politically, and you can see rates of no religion across the country continuing to increase dramatically, and so there's that whole irreligious socialization bit, and within the family, but also within communities and broader societies and so on. And so I think I don't want to be too linear about it, but I do think it's even more acceptable now for sure.
This is a little bit of a nerdy methodology question,
Sure.
so we can set it aside till tomorrow if you want. But you just mentioned something really interesting about your field method. When you're asking people in 2024, tell us about how you became not religious in the 60s or 70s or 80s or whenever in the past. I wonder how you experience those stories, because as you were saying, people are looking back 30, 40, 50 years, but they're telling you that story about back then from a vantage point of today, where they're or the social environment in which they're having that conversation is totally different than
Mhm.
1962 or something, right?
Yeah.
So what's your sense of that? If that's maybe, again, two kind of,
I think it's
Insightful.
just a wonderful question, and I really hope to get into that tomorrow at Coffee Talk, like those kind of things,
Yeah.
because for sure more. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to call them worries, but thoughts about, yeah, because we're constructing the narrative and the memories of our life as we go along, and to what extent does the person's sort of narrative or personal history of how they left belief, I'm not answering your question, but yeah, to what extent I'm grappling with that. Is that shaped by the fact that, which relates to my answer to the question just previously, that we're in probably a culture that's maybe more secular or open to non-belief than at the time. And I'm certainly, I mean, there's, of course, I won't get into it too much, but of course, there's a wide literature about the practice of oral history and how to grapple with those things. But sometimes the story that you're telling is in part a story about how those journeys were remembered, in addition to what happened and when it happened and that kind of thing. But I'm also interested in that story about how those journeys were remembered and why perhaps and another, it just relates to what you just asked, Paul, but is, for people who maybe hadn't thought much about non-belief, I'm also naming their non-belief, right? There's that kind of interesting little quirk in the nerdy methodological process, right? Like of something that maybe people hadn't given a lot of thought to, but they see my ad in the paper and go, oh yeah, I don't.
that's me.
Yeah, that's me. I never, and I definitely had a number of people I talked to said, I really liked your term unbeliever, and that kind of thing. I never called myself that. So those are things, that I'm definitely grappling with, and I think they're really interesting, and they tell maybe a different kind of story than just what happened. But yeah, definitely.
Brian, and then Rachel, and then Jessica.
Thanks, Tina. This is fascinating. Of course, I'm old enough to have lived through it. One of the things I was wondering is the degree to which people were able to associate their own journey of unbelief to things that were happening around them. And I'm thinking specifically of things like, one of the things about religion is it was a primary source of community. Certainly, if you lived in a rural, it might be you're virtually that and the associated clubs that were all focused around. So when you start to see patterns of urbanization, were people able to talk about that, about being able to find alternative communities that would support their unbelief as opposed to make them feel, excluded?
That's such a wonderful question, and I do think community and the search for community is a thread that I'm wanting to sort of tease out, and I haven't done as much of that yet but I want to do that because and were they successful in finding that community? Sometimes. I haven't interviewed a ton of people who, there's always there's like secular humanist organizations and those kinds of things. I have interviewed a few people who have sought out community in sort of more secular kind of those kind of rationalist kind of communities and that kind of thing. But I definitely see a strand of I don't know how to say this, and I don't want it to be negative, like a sense of, but yeah, kind of a sense of loss for some of that community, for some who were involved in the church, and saying, I miss that. I miss that we don't have that anymore. And I definitely, a number of people I interviewed said, I tried once we had kids, we went back to the church and tried, and this is great. We have this community and something happened and everybody came around and this is great. But all the while, I don't believe in any of this and that kind of thing. And so wanting to reconcile those two things of, I don't believe in this, I maybe don't really even agree with this church in all the ways that I should, but I really want this community. So I do think there is, and again, I don't want it to be a sort of negative thing, because the people I interviewed have rich, full lives, and relationships, absolutely. But in terms of, there is this strand of, for some who had church communities who feel a sense of loss with that, and who are searching for sort of like-minded people, but don't maybe want to join a rationalist group or a secular humanist group or those kinds of things. So yeah, I think it's something in there, right? About and there is this, I know, like the humanists, I've read quite a bit of the literature in the Humanist Association, and there's always this sense that, you know, humanists and atheists and that kind of thing, they're not joiners, they're individualists, and that they can't get them to, you know, they don't have a, you know, they have, these are people with rich lives and rich meaning in their lives, but maybe not one thing around which to gather. And yeah, it makes me think of the atheist church we were once at a conference, and Elliot, who's online, and there were the others, and Lynn, of course, was on the history of atheism in London. And at the same time we were having this conference, the atheist church was happening, and it was just kind of interesting for people who miss the music and the community and the fellowship. But yeah, I do see that, and I'll be teasing that strand out for sure.
Thank you, Rachel.
I'm going to ask two together because I think it works, mostly because you were just kind of talking about Elliot's question a little bit, so I think you can answer this pretty quickly. He's wondering what the humanists and humanist organizations you studied make of this shifting secularization. Did they find an increase in their ranks, or did the religious intolerance or religious indifference mean that people didn't really care about humanism either? So you kind of were already touching on that, so I think you can answer that quickly. And then, so I'll just add Patricia Killen's question too, wondering about if you've unpacked the connotations of the use of the word hypocrisy and hypocritical on the part of your interviewees. If so, do you have any thoughts on what the use of that word suggests about larger changes in the world of religion and the larger society?
Nice, such great questions. Loving these questions. Yes, to the first one. Like, I think in terms of the Humanist Association of Canada, I do think there is this there's this sense that people are indifferent to religion, and they're also different to humanism. They're not wanting to. There's also certainly in the humanist archival writings a lot of sense that by the 60s, 70s or so, lots of evidence that there seems to be a sense that there is a wider openness to humanism, and they're getting more time on the air. They're the stigma against atheism, unbelief, humanism, secular humanism is declining. So I definitely see that in the literature. But at the same time, the humanist membership declines quite dramatically in that time period. I think it might be kind of related in a sense, right? Because a lot of the humanist focus, and they debate about this a lot at the time, is on sort of challenging the churches, issues of church and state, religion in schools, and that kind of thing. And as I suggested in my talk, in the 60s is sort of there's a surge of that kind of criticism, sort of more widely across Canada. And when that, it doesn't go away, but when it sort of maybe dies down a bit, and some of the struggles about religion in the school and the issues of church and state and that kind of thing are, I guess, sort of resolved somewhat in the 70s. Maybe their sort of reason for being, I don't want to anger any of the humanists, but it kind of declines a bit, right? And so they definitely are struggling with that at the time. The word hypocrisy, I love that question, Patricia, and I would love to talk more about it. I haven't deconstructed it, but I do think you're onto something, and it's worthy of deconstruction. The fact that it emerges, and this actually, when I think about it, might relate a bit back to Paul's nerdy question about about the language. When we hear about the hypocrisy of the churches over and over again, and then it becomes part of their narrative about why they left the church and that kind of thing. I don't know. I'm just piecing some pieces together. But thank you for raising it, Patricia. And I think that it's really a good path to go down for sure.
Yeah. Jessica and Devian.
Thank you. Yeah, Katina, I was asked about that word hypocrisy also, and wondering about were there examples of what the types of hypocrisy was? Was it, that church ladies can be nasty gossips, or was it related to civil rights or sexual ethics?
Oh my gosh, all of the above. So many things. Like some, yeah, I didn't get a chance to sort of dive into it, but definitely there's the larger, and again, this might relate more to like sort of narratives of what they hear about the Christian churches and that kind of thing. So just, Christian churches are, they're responsible for grievous wrongs, and yet they, preach love and that kind of thing. So lots of that for sure. So sort of the more sort of broader statements about hypocrisy, which I think again, sort of what Patricia's getting at is, it would be interesting to interrogate that, but also lots of sort of more specific examples. And the ones that comes immediately to mind, because I did touch a bit on feminism and gender, are some related to sort of encounters with sexism within the churches, and I think I know a woman talked about being, sort of patted on the bum by a preacher and that kind of thing, like sort of sexual harassment within the churches, and then seeing the preacher up, preaching and preaching love and respect and that kind of thing. So lots of specific examples for sure of, and again, the ones that are coming to mind are of women, dealing with sexism and sexism within as church workers and that kind of thing. Being sort of sick and tired of being used and that kind of thing within the church, but also, as you're suggesting, the broader kind of, well, they're hypocritical because they support war and like that kind of thing, and preach peace on the other hand. But yeah, there's so much to tease out there, which is really interesting. Great question.
If I could just attach a question to both Patricia's question and Jessica's question, which I think are really good. But then also to go back to the methodological issue. So you're talking to people in the last 5 or 8 years, let's say, and that's all TRC years, really, right? So people, of course, in the 60s and 70s, terrible things were happening in residential schools. White folks just didn't really know about it generally. But now it's impossible for Christians today to not have that conversation all the time. It seems like it's such a dominant question on their minds, right? So when you come into them and say, tell me how you felt about when you left the church in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and sure, they're narrating that story and they're going to give examples about gender and that kind of hypocrisy. But I wonder to what extent the animus has just been tripled by the TRC.
That is such a good point, and again relates to, like you're saying, how the present day is shaping these narratives and people's discussion of hypocrisy and that kind of thing. This is all tied together, and for sure, that is there, and there are a number of interviewees mentioning, specifically the TRC and that kind of thing, but also sort of the more general hypocrisy of the churches, I think, ties into that, and definitely something you have to grapple with and mull in the writing up of the methodology and thinking through those narratives of how that's impacting it. Absolutely, that's a great point.
Viviani, and then Ellen.
So, firstly, wonderful presentation. Does your research include mosque goers, temple goers, gurudwara goers, and the indigenous community? Because for many immigrants and indigenous communities, these places of worship could be more about religion. Actually, it could be more about their connection to their roots and making sense of their identity. And my second question was, and you can answer this tomorrow in the coffee talk, how do you make sense of the words religious, unbelief, and spirituality, and how do you differentiate between them? Because in the 70s and 80s, the West was being exposed to a lot of Eastern spiritualities when the Beatles were traveling to India. So, and spiritual is such a millennial term.
Says the millennial.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Davina, for these questions. And you and I chatted briefly about the interviews, and I haven't interviewed outside of I have interviewed, and Lynn and I have chatted a bit about it, a few Jews, but I haven't interviewed people outside of the Jewish or the Christian context. But I would love to talk to you more about the possibility for doing that, and whether it would be possible to get the demographic that I'm looking for, age-wise and that kind of thing. But it's definitely an area that I'm not, would love to chat more with it. And I do think it makes my study, sort of specific to a particular Christian, anti-Christian kind of thing, movement for sure. And then, yeah, in terms of defining the terms, I'm pretty muddy with my terms, unbelief and irreligion. I do tend to use them in a pretty flexible kind of way. But you're right, the word spirituality in that time period in my interviews, definitely, I talk with my interviews about spirituality. I would say most of them say, do not want to use that term. I don't if it's not a term that they ascribe to. But I, absolutely recognize that those terms are changing in that time period in terms of all the stuff that's going on. So, but yeah, I don't know. I can talk more about how to define unbelief, but I know it's I do tend to sort of define it in a very broad kind of way for sure.
So now Alan Batten has put up his hand, and I can't ever not let him ask. Alan's questions are uniformly brilliant, but perhaps if you ask a question that is going to require a really thick, long answer, we can perhaps pick it up tomorrow. But please do ask it.
Will require a short
Okay.
answer. I would like to suggest a possibly fruitful line of future research.
Sure.
That you interview some of us who have stayed within formal religion, be we Christians, Jews, Muslims, or what have you. And we call ourselves believers, yes, but what exactly do we believe? And many of us wrestle with traditional doctrines. You might find that we actually have quite a lot in common with the people who call themselves unbelievers.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Yeah. I love that as the final question. And to be honest, I have, for my research, I'll just say one very quick thing. I know we need to end, but done quite a bit of reading in church archival and periodicals from the time. And in the back of my head, I'm I feel like I need to have a section about doubt in the church and among churchgoers and people who are quote unquote believers and that kind of thing. So thank you for that.
All right. Thanks very much, Dan.